let's start with those comments we heard from Joe Biden. A change in tone, but are they really going to change anything?
Thank you for having me. The tone is changing in the last few weeks quite considerably, but at the same time, $14 billion of aid was actually appropriate yesterday in Congress. And that's the big question. Well, the tone and the displeasure, to say the least, by President Biden and other officials within his administration towards the way Israel is conducting the war in Gaza is translated into action. We are far for it. So last week, the United States imposed what looked to be a separate issue, but closely related, imposed sanctions on some settlers, violent settlers. But then the signaling is more and more that the United States doesn't see eye to eye with Israel. But the big question at one point, it put pressure on what we see the negotiation now that would lead to a truce, a 6 weeks truce, which we can assume if it lasts for 6 weeks, it probably also will signal the end of the war.
And international pressure is mounting on Israel to change tactics. I mean, is Israel really about to go into Rafah, though? I mean, considering the extraordinary diplomatic fallout that would follow.
Well, one option, which I'm not so sure it's the likely scenario, that the Israeli government is actually bluffing and it doesn't want to go into Gaza, but want pressure to mount in order to release the hostages or even some of the leadership, the Hamas leadership, to surrender. I'm not so sure this is the likely scenario. The other, they intend to go into Rafah, but this probably will end in huge death toll among not only Hamas militants, but also among civilians, and this will increase Israel isolation internationally, and hence we see the pressure, because there is it's hard for me to see a plan when you have 1.5 million people, 6 times more than were there on October 7. Most of them are IDP. Displaced, internally displaced people, how they are evacuated to other parts of Gaza and just living, for Hamas and the IDF to fight. So the end result of it, and that's what the international community, whether states or the United Nations, UNRWA, are so fearful of, that this will end in a huge bloodbath, and this has to be avoided at any price.
But Israel does insist there will be a plan to protect civilians in Rafah. Realistic, though, what could that look like?
It's very difficult to see, because it means that you let around 1.5 million people to leave. Where are they going? We saw it in other phases of the war, that people were told you'll be safe in another place, but then they were not necessarily safe. They were bombed too. So the question is where they are going, and bear in mind, a lot of the houses were already destroyed. There is not enough humanitarian aid is entering as it is, and moving, and relatively quickly, 1.5 million. How Israel, for instance, even from its own military objective, how it can secure that among the 1.5 million, there are not only Hamas people are moving with them, so then what is going to find in Rafah? There are so many ifs and buts that it's hard to see how they're conducting at the same time a war against Hamas and evacuating peacefully in a way which is also humane the civilians to other places.
You say there are lots of ifs and buts, which will surely factor into this 6-week ceasefire that the United States is working on with those other countries. It's interesting you say that might signal the end of this conflict. But of course, Biden is no doubt also treading very carefully ahead of presidential elections there.
Yeah, I think if 6 weeks if the war continues, it will be on much more low intensity and more targeted, and allow both sides to reconsider the way they conduct this war. But yes, it's election year. To be fair, it's not that the voters, those who threaten not to vote for Biden, have a much better alternative, because at the end of the day, the alternative is probably going to be Donald Trump. So if even those who would like to see a more balanced view, a more balanced foreign policy from the United States when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I can't see it's coming actually from a Trump administration. We still remember his wonderful deal of the century that definitely was not a sign of an honest broker from the United States. So, yes, they might decide to punish Biden, and President Biden need to take into account and might end even with a Wells candidate there.